Hi everyone, this is Linda with Overbrook Quilt Connection, and today's block is block 28 and it's called Groovy Granny, and it's kind of a variation on a granny square, which what I know of granny squares is from crocheting, and I don't crochet. I've tried and I can't seem to learn it, but it's kind of rings that come out from a center point. Colored rings that go around from a center point. So this is kind of the same idea. So let me see. I'm hoping I can make it so you can see most of this. This block is laid out in diagonal rows, which is different than how we have been doing things throughout this series. And because of the diagonal rows, there are setting or row beginners and enders of triangles. And those are cut, the ones that go around the sides were cut from a big 5 1/4 triangle, or square, sorry, 5 1/4 square cut twice on the diagonal. And the reason for that is then you have your long edge is the straight grain of fabric, and your bias edges are encased in the seams on either side of it. So only the straight edge is left exposed. So it minimizes the stretching. Now, they also have us cut corner squares. So there's 12 of these triangles. You take 3 squares, cut them in fourths, so you have 12 of these triangles. Then we have 3 1/4 inch squares that are cut once on the diagonal to get 4 of these. They're a little bit smaller, but they have the straight of grain on 2 sides, and only the long edge is bias, and that is encased in the seam, and then what is left over is the 2 sides of the straight of grain. So of course there's 4 of those for the 4 corners. So our rows are going to be, you start small, get big at the center, and then you go back to small again. So by small, I mean our first row is 1 single square with 2 triangles on either side. And it says in the pattern that the triangles are intentionally cut oversized because once it's all done, we're going to square it up. So I've already gotten the other side of this done because we get narrow to wide, and then we go back to narrow again. So I've done half of the block, the other half of the block. So our first row is going to consist of 1 square with 2 triangles on either side. And you need to watch the direction of your triangles. For your first half, all the triangles on either side, they're opposite of each other, but they all have the excess points at the bottom of the row, okay? So like here is our second row. Our second row consists of one of our, so we have essentially 3 colors in the rings. We have a dark, then we have kind of a medium, and then I kind of have a medium dark. Again, you can scrap this up if you want. You do not need to have the ring feel to it if you don't want to. So this would be the second. The first row was just a single block. The second row is a block of 3, and so the medium is adjacent to the medium dark, and then there's 2 framing ones on either side of it, and then we have our triangles again. Again, the triangles are headed down. They're headed the same direction. You want when these are sewn together, they're going to make a continuous border. It's going to become what makes our block square when it's done. So in order to join our rows, I'm going to trim these triangle tips off, so then I have a straight edge to sew my seams together like that. Okay, so our next block, our next row, so we went from 1 to 3 to 5. And that then gets all of our, gets our dark, medium, and medium dark all in one row. Again, we finish it with our triangles that are the same way with the extra points going down. So that is this row here, like that. So that gets all 5 of them together. Then our center row has our center block in it. So we're at 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, we're at 7. So we have medium dark on either side, then light or medium, then dark, then background. Now, these do not have those triangles on the end because they're going to be the corners. So at the bottom is one corner, then these will be 2 corners, and then there'll be another one like this at the other end for the 4th. Now, I wait to put these on until I have my block, until I have my rows sewn together. I don't do any of my corners until my rows are sewn together. They're the last step that I do. And the reason that I do that, in my mind, it just makes it like a cap. It's like capping off this, it's finishing that corner, finishing all the corners. So then when I'm done finishing my corners, then my block is finished except for squaring it up, if that makes sense. It's one of those silly things that makes sense in my head, but it may not make sense to you. Okay, once we have done our center, then we're going backwards again, and we go from the 7 to 5. And this time then our triangles, they would be, in this case, going what we would now call the top of the block, because it's next to, this one. So we're putting it above it. So it's kind of technically the top of the block. So instead of having the excess to the bottom, like we've had all this time, we've now turned our blocks, and our diagonal is getting bigger, and then we get the biggest it's going to be, and then it goes back to smaller again. So we're going smaller, so our diagonal is going the opposite direction. It'll make a little more sense when I get all of the rows sewn together, and I can show it to you as the rows, ready to be joined to each other. So let me stop and do that, and I'll come back and show you the next steps. I have, oh goodness, let me put this back in my tripod. Nothing quite like technical difficulties, but anyhow, I have this block put into rows now, but I don't have any of my rows joined yet. So you can see that, this is row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I don't have any of the corners put on. The seams will all nest because they're pressed opposite each other all the way. But in order to join the rows, I'm going to cut these tips off so I have a straight edge to sew along, because tips that big are going to be annoying, I think anyway. Some people like to hang on to them, but to trim these off, I'm going to line up my ruler along, put a mark along the seam line where the triangle and the square are joined, and then I'm just gonna trim those off. Okay, so now my row is straight. All right, I'm gonna do that again with the next one to get that into a straight edge. because we're joining squares, our edge may not be as straight as it would be if you had like sliced a strip set, for instance. So, you know, don't worry about it if your edge isn't completely straight, but you at least have these tips now straightened off so you can. Also, I forgot to say, when I was joining my rows, I always start, when I'm putting on the triangles, I always start from the square end and go out to stitch that. So these are now going to nest together because they are pressed oppositely. So I'm going to finish putting all these rows together, and then I'm going to show you how to put the corners on. I have the block put together except for the corners. And as you can see, 2 of the corners, the tips are cut off because I did that as I was cutting all the tips off for my rows. But this is the center row right here, and it has the tips still hanging on it. So we need to trim those off in order to have a flat edge to put the corner triangle on. So what I am doing right now is I'm putting a line along this seam line, which is 1 row in, and I'm also making sure I'm straight along this seam between the triangle and the 1 block in this row. And I'm going to trim off both my triangles, so that gives me then a straight edge to put the triangle on. I'm going to repeat that over here. So again, I'm going to line a line up here. I'm going to make sure that I have a line on that seam and this seam. So then that gives me a straight edge here. And I'm going to show you this one. If you can see that, with me having a white shirt on, that's probably not helpful. But right here, this edge is not exactly straight. This triangle sticks out just a little bit farther than the square, but I'm going to leave that because here with my hand behind it, I think that will make it easier for you to see. I'm going to leave that because really that is a straight edge, because I had a straight edge here and a straight edge here, so I know that that has to be straight. All right, also when I was pressing my seams, I pressed them away from the center row. Now, it really does not matter which way you press this. I thought it was easier for you to see how the rows line up, because see, when you stitch, we've cut. So this is the edge where we've trimmed off the tips of the triangle, and then this is the next row coming into it. And where you stitch, that should be a pretty even, I mean, that should come out pretty evenly where this triangle and this edge come in. So when you're all said and done, you should have pretty straight edges to your square, or almost square at this point. But if you don't get all bent out of shape about it, because again, we are going to be squaring up this block, and it's not going to matter in the end. So now, to put these on, I'm going to find my center, and I'm going to finger press that. Then I'm going to do the same with the triangle. I'm going to finger press that. Then I'm going to match the centers and put a pin there. All right, then I'm also going to pin my ends. And your corners may or may not match as well. I mean, it doesn't look like mine's going to, when I put my seam on, it looks like it's going to end up a little jagged there. I don't think I have a full 1/4 inch seam allowance from the edge to here. But again, that's okay. We're going to be squaring this up. Let me repeat that process on the next corner. Again, I am finger pressing my center, finger pressing a corner along the long edge, matching my centers, pinning it, and then pinning my ends so they don't wiggle as I am stitching them, because we're doing, that's a bias edge we're working on, so it's pretty flexible. All right, I'm going to finish pinning these other 2 corners on, sew them, then I'll show you the finished block and I'll show you the squaring up. I have the block done now as far as piecing. It's all pieced. The corners, I went ahead and pressed them out. Again, I wanted you to see that my edges are not as straight here as it is, you know, with the bigger triangles. But the pattern says that this is oversized, and so the intention is that we're going to square it up. So to do that, I have a 12.5-inch ruler, and I must admit I'm not very fond of this ruler. I need to replace it. I have some grip stuff on the back, but it still wants to slide on me some. So anyhow, the reference points for this are the points of your center square. Half of 12.5 is 6 1/4. So I want my 6 1/4 inch line of my ruler. See if that helps. I want my 6 1/4 inch line of my ruler to bisect the point, the top point of my center square and the bottom point of my center square. And then again with the top and bottom, the center between, there's 4 diamonds across the top and bottom. So in that center, I want my 6 1/4 to be there. All right, then across this way, I want my 6 1/4 to do the same thing. I want it to bisect the points side to side and also between the top and bottom. So once I've got those 4 lined up, then I'm going to trim what's extra. Again, things want to wiggle on me, so I really have to hold this down. All right, so I have 2 of my sides done. So then I'm going to turn it, and again, even though I've got these 2 sides to where my ruler can just sit on them, I'm still going to check my reference points. I want to be sure that nothing has gotten twisted or moved while I was cutting. And so again, I'm lining up those reference points, the 6 1/4 inch lines on this block. And then I'm going to trim my remaining 2 sides. All right, so this block is now squared up. Now, it also said in the pattern, your background, you wanted to at least have a 1/4 inch between your points and the edge after you've squared it up. But it also said you might have more than that. And if that's the case, the block will kind of appear to float, and that is absolutely fine. So it's not, the only thing to think about on that is that you don't want less than a 1/4 inch around here, because then you're going to lose the points of the outside of your colored squares. Also, I wanted to now that, you know, at the beginning I talked about the corners kind of capping the block, that's what I meant by that. It just finishes off each of the squares. You just, or each of the points of, or corners of the square, you just know that it's finished. It just somehow makes sense to my brain, more so than trying to hook the corners in at the time that you're doing the rows. So if you have a different method that works for you, use it. Also, I just kind of wanted to point out that this is the exact same method for doing a quilt, setting a quilt on point. So the blocks are constructed like this as a square, but then when you actually put them in your quilt, if you're looking at the top to the bottom of the quilt, then your blocks would all be on the diagonal like that. So you would construct your rows identical to what we did in this block, and you would have setting triangles that finished each row, and you'd have corners to finish each corner of your quilt. So in essence, you've learned how to set a quilt on point by constructing this block. So maybe that's a new technique you haven't tried yet, and after doing this block, maybe you'll be a little more comfortable in giving it a try. Anyhow, I hope you have a good time with this block. Again, this is block 28, Groovy Granny. And you know what? We only have 2 blocks left in this series. So we'll see you back tomorrow with block 29. Thanks.